You are sitting in a room filled with strangers. A question is asked. You know the answer, but something stops you. You hesitate, then remain silent. The reason is not ignorance. It is not doubt. It is something deeper, something colder, something older. You feel shame crawling through your chest, like a hand that does not belong to you. We rarely talk about it, but shame controls more of our lives than we care to admit. It lurks beneath decisions, behind silence, within the small moments where you shrink yourself to fit expectations. Shame does not raise its voice. It does not slap. It whispers. It asks a quiet question, one you have heard your entire life. What will they think of you? In those moments, you do not speak. You adjust your tone. You laugh when you are not amused. You apologize for truths that were never wrong. And just like that, you become easy to mold. Not because someone told you what to do, but because shame already taught you how to feel. This is not just emotional discomfort. This is dark psychology at its finest, an ancient mechanism built to regulate behavior, repurposed to reshape identity. When we think of manipulation, we often imagine coercion or lies. But the most effective form of control does not force you. It convinces you to do it to yourself. Shame makes that possible. Somewhere along your life, you learned that being wrong is not a mistake. It is a defect. You were punished not for what you did, but for who you were while doing it. You learned that approval is earned by minimizing yourself, not by discovering yourself. You learned that to be accepted, you must first reject a part of who you are. The voice of shame is rarely yours. It is the memory of a parent's disapproval, a teacher's criticism, a peer's laughter. It is the voice of others, internalized as your own. And that voice does not just echo in your head, it scripts your life. This is how shame makes people easy to mold. Not through force, but through distortion. It warps your perception of self until obedience feels like safety, until silence feels like virtue, until invisibility feels like peace. And here is the terrifying part. The more shame you carry, the less resistance you show. Not because you lack strength, but because you have been trained to believe your strength is dangerous. You begin to think before you speak. Then you stop speaking. You begin to doubt your feelings. Then you stop feeling. You begin to apologize for existing. Then you stop existing in the way you were meant to. That is how molding begins. Slowly, invisibly, internally. You look around and see others acting freely. But inside you wonder how they do it, not realizing they are asking the same about you. Because most people do not notice they are shaped until it is too late to remember what their original shape was. Shame is not just an emotion. It is a system, a weapon, a design. And like all good designs in dark psychology, it works best when you believe it is for your own good. What if that belief is the trap? What if everything you thought shame was doing for you was actually being done to you? We are only beginning to peel back the surface, and what lies underneath, you might not be ready to see. But if you want to understand how this quiet emotion has shaped your life, your thoughts, and your voice, stay with me, because the lie you were raised on is far darker than you imagined, and the truth begins there. From childhood, you were told that shame makes you a better person, that it corrects your behavior, sharpens your conscience, and leads you toward moral growth. You were praised for feeling bad after mistakes. You were punished until you felt the appropriate amount of remorse. You were shaped to believe that shame was a compass, guiding you toward the right path. But that belief is a lie, and a dangerous one. Shame is not morality. Shame is the fear of disconnection. It does not ask whether something is wrong. It asks whether you will still be accepted. It is not born from justice. It is born from the terror of being cast out. The false belief that shame builds moral character is one of the most powerful tools in dark psychology. It allows people to accept emotional punishment as personal responsibility. It convinces them to internalize judgment and carry it as if it were truth. It replaces the question of ethics with the obsession for approval. Think back to how you were raised. Were you taught to understand right from wrong through reason and empathy, or were you taught to obey through consequences and humiliation? Many people are not raised with morality, they are raised with compliance. The classroom, the family dinner, the church pew, these are not just spaces of learning, they are arenas of emotional conditioning. You learn to sit still, not because you understand the value of patience, but because you fear the sting of being called disruptive. You learn to apologize, not because you hurt someone, but because someone else felt uncomfortable with your truth. In these environments, shame is not used to develop your inner compass. It is used to erase it, slowly, silently, thoroughly. And once you believe that shame is a teacher, you stop questioning the lesson. You accept the correction, even when the correction breaks your spirit. You nod in agreement, even when the guilt was never yours to hold. This is how people become easy to mold. They learn to measure their goodness, not by what they know, but by how little they offend. They grow fearful of being seen, because being seen might reveal a flaw. They shrink from their own thoughts, afraid that expression will lead to exclusion. And as they do, they become more pliable, more obedient, more quiet. This lie has persisted across generations, reinforced by culture, religion, and education. Entire systems rely on shame to maintain order, but the order it brings is not peace, it is paralysis. In philosophical terms, shame turns moral agency into social dependency. It replaces the pursuit of truth with the pursuit of belonging. It does not ask what is right, it asks what will keep you safe from judgment. What you call self-control may actually be self-abandonment. To understand how shame has shaped your life, you must first challenge the belief that it was meant to help you, because the lie of moral shame is not just a mistake, it is a design. You were not taught to be moral, you were trained to be acceptable. And the part of you that was punished into silence may still be waiting to speak. Shame operates at the most fundamental level of human biology. It is not merely an emotion, but a full-body threat response. When triggered, it activates the limbic system, specifically the amygdala, which detects danger. The human brain does not distinguish between a threat to physical safety and a threat to social belonging. In both cases, the reaction is survival-driven. The feeling of shame initiates a stress response. Cortisol levels rise, heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow, muscles tense. These physiological changes are designed to prepare the body for protection. In the case of shame, that protection comes not from escape, but from silence and submission. The body reacts by trying to disappear. Over time, repeated experiences of shame condition the brain to anticipate disconnection. Functional magnetic resonance imaging studies have revealed increased activity in regions associated with pain. When individuals recall shame-inducing events, the brain interprets social rejection through the same circuits that process physical injury. That overlap creates a deeply rooted pattern of avoidance. Long-term exposure to shame alters the brain's development. The prefrontal cortex, which governs judgment and critical thinking, becomes inhibited under chronic emotional stress. Neural pathways associated with fear and behavioral inhibition become dominant. As a result, decision-making becomes risk-averse. Creativity and confidence decline. Self-monitoring increases. These biological shifts occur most intensely during childhood and adolescence, in homes, schools, and institutions, where shame is used as a disciplinary method. Young brains adapt by creating internal systems of defense. These systems become permanent neurological strategies. They do not wait for external authority. They act automatically, triggered by internalized fear. Children raised in high shame environments often exhibit symptoms of hypervigilance. They watch faces for signs of disapproval. They modify their behavior without instruction. They hesitate to ask questions. Their primary concern is not learning or engagement, but avoidance of rejection. In psychological terms, this is a trauma response built on emotional conditioning. In adult life, this response continues. Individuals with chronic shame sensitivity tend to show overactivation in the medial prefrontal cortex and underactivation in areas related to emotional regulation. These patterns correspond with withdrawal, hesitation, and self-censorship. Under social pressure, the body recalls past disapproval and repeats protective behavior. Shame does not instruct, it inhibits. It does not teach values, it enforces compliance. In many behavioral psychology experiments, individuals who were subjected to shaming interventions were less likely to engage in open communication afterward. They became more secretive, more passive, and more likely to avoid social exposure. The concept of learned helplessness aligns with these outcomes. When repeated efforts to assert individuality are met with correction or humiliation, the brain learns that expression is unsafe. Over time, autonomy fades. People stop trying to be different. They settle into patterns that feel familiar, even when those patterns restrict growth. In the framework of dark psychology, shame is not a corrective force. It is a mechanism of control. It does not guide behavior through insight or wisdom. It limits behavior through fear. The more often shame is used, the more effective the limitation becomes. The subject requires less and less pressure over time. Unlike punishment, which requires external enforcement, shame is internal. It functions as self-surveillance. The individual carries the memory of the shamer, adopting their values, expressions, and criticisms as part of the self. Behavior becomes shaped not by conscious reflection, but by unconscious association. This mechanism benefits systems that depend on conformity, religious institutions, educational authorities, and rigid workplace hierarchies. Rely on internalized shame to reduce resistance. Obedience achieved through guilt lacks permanence. Obedience achieved through shame becomes structural. Neurologically, shame strengthens the neural circuits that support avoidance. These include pathways from the amygdala to the hippocampus and connections between the anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex. These circuits form loops that reinforce emotional withdrawal. The longer they operate without interruption, the more ingrained the behavior becomes. The result is a molded mind, a person who no longer requires direction to behave predictably, a person who corrects their own tone, filters their words, and suppresses original thought without prompt, a person shaped from the inside. This is not a product of personality. It is the outcome of emotional engineering. Shame rewires the brain to follow specific patterns of obedience. Once established, these patterns persist through adulthood, reinforced by social feedback and internal repetition. Control achieved through fear must be maintained. Control achieved through shame sustains itself. In systems that demand order, obedience becomes the highest value. The most efficient method to produce that obedience is not force but shame. Shame does not require supervision. It trains the subject to self-regulate. It does not need threats. It uses silence. It does not use violence. It uses the fear of humiliation. Social conformity emerges from the desire to remain included. Human beings are wired to avoid exclusion. Belonging is a fundamental need. In studies of social behavior, researchers like Solomon Asch demonstrated that individuals often conform to a group's opinion, even when the opinion is clearly false. The pressure to align with the group overrides personal judgment. Shame reinforces this tendency. It acts as a punishment for deviation. In a group setting, when one person steps out of line and receives shame, others observe the consequence. They learn not to make the same mistake. They do not need to be punished directly. Observation is enough to create conformity. In the obedience experiments conducted by Stanley Milgram, participants were instructed to administer electric shocks to another person. Most complied, even when the task became visibly distressing. The reason was not malice, it was submission to authority. Behind that submission was an unspoken fear of standing out, of being the one who resists, of being the one who must explain. Shame makes resistance feel dangerous, not because it leads to pain, but because it leads to exposure. This is the mechanism exploited by institutions. In school, a child who challenges a rule is often shamed in front of others, not physically harmed, but labeled as disrespectful or disobedient. The message is not that the rule matters. The message is that questioning the rule carries social cost. In workplaces, professionals who question standard procedures may face subtle isolation. Their ideas are ignored. Their names are excluded. They are described as difficult, not for what they say, but for not matching the expected tone. Shame is delivered not in words, but in withdrawal. This training begins early and continues without pause. Children are praised for compliance. They are corrected for behavior that draws attention. Even curiosity can be punished if it disrupts the group. Over time, the brain learns a pattern: stay quiet, follow instructions, do not risk disapproval. In psychological terms, this is behavioral shaping, a method where reinforcement and punishment are used to create desired outcomes. Shame becomes the invisible tool. It molds individuals not by removing options, but by attaching fear to specific choices. When people are trained this way, they develop scripts. These are internal narratives about what can and cannot be done. The script does not need to be logical. It only needs to feel safe. Once established, the script takes over. A person no longer evaluates a situation. They follow the familiar emotional path. In dark psychology, this process is intentional. The goal is not to educate, but to regulate. Control is achieved, not by issuing commands, but by limiting the internal dialogue that allows people to resist. Shame disables that dialogue. It teaches the individual to suppress dissonance, to obey without analysis. Once obedience becomes automatic, external control becomes minimal. Institutions require fewer rules. Leaders require less authority. People monitor themselves. They adjust each word. They correct each action. They silence their instincts. And they do it with the belief that they are being responsible. This belief is essential. Shame-based obedience must feel moral. Otherwise, resistance may return. Therefore, systems promote the idea that conformity is a sign of maturity, that following rules is a form of wisdom, that avoiding offense is a mark of character. This is not ethical growth. It is compliance dressed as integrity. Control through shame is more stable than control through punishment. It does not provoke rebellion. It prevents it. It does not cause conflict. It dissolves the desire to fight. It creates people who look peaceful, but are quietly afraid. The effectiveness of this training depends on repetition. Shame must be experienced often enough to become familiar. The subject must reach a point where shame is expected. When that point is reached, change becomes difficult. The brain interprets discomfort not as a signal to adapt, but as a warning to stay small. In this state, the molded person is no longer a threat. They do not challenge, not because they agree, but because they no longer believe disagreement is survivable. This is how obedience is manufactured without chains, not by breaking the body, but by shaping the mind. Shame does not emerge without purpose. It is shaped, reinforced, and maintained by systems that benefit from silence. These systems are not abstract ideas. They are institutions, ideologies, and social hierarchies, built to function smoothly when individuals do not question their place. Shame is not a side effect. It is a mechanism. Political structures, religious organizations, corporate institutions, and even cultural traditions all rely on forms of behavioral regulation. They do not need to monitor every action when individuals internalize the rules. Shame is the tool that creates this internalization. It makes enforcement unnecessary by turning the subject into their own observer. Michel Foucault, in his study of power and discipline, explained how modern society shifted from visible punishment to invisible control. He described a model where surveillance leads to self-discipline. The watchtower is not always occupied, yet the prisoner behaves. The same logic applies in daily life. The authority does not need to speak. The threat of shame is enough. Erich Fromm explored this idea further. In his analysis of modern freedom, He noted that people often escape from liberty rather than embrace it. Freedom requires responsibility. It demands thought and action without guarantees. Shame offers a substitute. It tells the individual what to be, how to act, and when to be quiet. It provides structure at the cost of identity. Philip Zimbardo's research into social behavior revealed how ordinary people adopt roles imposed by external forces. In controlled environments, individuals shifted from ethical reasoning to mechanical obedience. What enabled this transformation was not belief in the role, it was fear of social rejection. Shame functioned as the boundary. Step outside it, and isolation followed. These insights reveal a consistent theme. Shame is not random, it is managed. Those who sit at the top of hierarchies have no interest in a population full of independent minds. Independent minds are unpredictable. They challenge doctrine. They demand truth. Molded minds, on the other hand, are easy to guide. They follow trends. They echo messages. They maintain order without force. Religious institutions have long used shame to define morality, not by teaching ethical reasoning, but by labeling human instincts as sinful. Desire, doubt, and dissent are cast as flaws. Redemption is offered only through obedience. The result is not enlightenment, it is compliance, masked as virtue. In corporate environments, shame appears through performance reviews, peer evaluations, and internal rankings. Productivity is not the only goal. Image becomes currency. Workers are trained to avoid risk, speak safely, and project loyalty. Those who deviate are not corrected. They are ignored. In this silence, shame grows. Political ideologies also rely on shame, not through policy, but through narrative. The framing of dissent as ignorance, the portrayal of disagreement as disloyalty, the labeling of complexity as weakness. These tactics do not silence voices with violence. They do so with discredit, and discredit, once internalized, becomes shame. Social media platforms have amplified this phenomenon. Algorithms reward conformity and outrage. Nuance disappears. The fear of public shaming prevents honest conversation. Users self-censor, not for lack of thought, but for survival. Opinions are sculpted, not by logic but by anticipated backlash. This is not engagement, it is submission. Across all these domains, the strategy remains consistent. Teach shame early, associate it with difference, reinforce it with silence, and reward those who comply. Those who benefit from this arrangement do not appear openly. Their control does not require direct involvement. Once shame is embedded, the system runs itself. A molded population does not need direction, it polices itself. This form of control is difficult to challenge. It leaves no bruises, it creates no martyrs, it writes no laws, it hides behind culture, tradition, and policy. It offers comfort in exchange for voice, safety in exchange for thought, inclusion in exchange for truth. By the time resistance begins, the individual's already been shaped. They speak with hesitation, they doubt their own insight, they defend the system that molded them, believing that shame kept them decent. But shame never aimed to create decency, its function was order. A society constructed upon the foundation of shame may appear peaceful on the surface, not because it has achieved genuine harmony, but because its individuals have learned to suppress their voices, their dissent, and their truth, in order to maintain the illusion of order. The concept of morality is often presented as absolute, timeless, and universal. It is taught as a set of fixed principles, guarded by culture and tradition. But morality, in most societies, has been filtered through power. What appears as ethical guidance is frequently a method of control. Shame plays a central role in this transformation. It is not a response to wrongdoing, it is a signal of nonconformity. In psychological terms, shame differs from guilt. Guilt is about action. It arises when a person violates their values. It leads to remorse, restitution, and understanding. Shame, however, is about identity. It does not say you did something wrong. It says you are wrong. It bypasses behavior and targets the self. When morality is hijacked, the line between ethics and obedience disappears. Individuals stop examining the rightness of actions. They begin focusing on acceptability. They seek to avoid disapproval, not to act justly. The compass is no longer internal. It is directed by those who define what is shameful. This shift begins early. Children are told what is good and bad, not by exploring outcomes, but through emotional feedback. A child who tells the truth and causes discomfort may be shamed. A child who lies to maintain peace may be praised. In this environment, ethics are distorted. The lesson is not to do what is right. The lesson is to avoid being the cause of discomfort. Religious institutions reinforce this distortion. Many doctrines describe morality through the lens of purity, sin, and divine surveillance. The focus is not on compassion or justice. It is on obedience and submission. Followers are taught to fear their impulses, to distrust their bodies, to accept authority without question. The use of shame in this context is deliberate. It creates a moral framework that serves the institution, not the individual. Cultural traditions extend this framework. Gender roles, family expectations, and social customs become infused with moral significance. Deviating from these roles is not simply unusual. It is labeled as shameful. A woman who speaks assertively, a man who shows vulnerability, a child who questions an elder. Each becomes a target, not for violating a moral law, but for threatening a social image. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche criticized this construction. He argued that moral codes often arise not from the noble pursuit of virtue, but from resentment and control. Those in power declare their preferences as universal truths. They shame others into compliance. They define goodness in terms that maintain their authority. Modern psychology supports this view. Studies on moral decision-making reveal that people often conform to group norms, even when those norms conflict with personal values. The desire to belong overrides the desire to act ethically. Shame becomes the enforcer of the group's standard, not truth, not justice. Popularity. Social media has accelerated this process. The public performance of virtue is rewarded. Outrage becomes currency. Individuals are praised for shaming others, even without understanding context. The goal is not ethical clarity, it is visibility. People learn to present morality in ways that align with the platform's emotional economy. Subtlety is lost, reflection is discouraged. Moral certainty becomes a performance. This performance is not harmless. It changes how people think. Nuance becomes dangerous. Doubt is seen as weakness. Agreement is expected. Those who resist are framed as threats. The moral conversation narrows. Dialogue is replaced by slogans. Thought is replaced by allegiance. In this environment, shame no longer rises from reflection. It is imposed from outside. It follows those who deviate from the expected script. It punishes difference. It suppresses dissent, and it does so under the banner of virtue. This is how morality is hijacked. Shame is the disguise. It presents obedience as goodness. It transforms submission into character. It replaces inner clarity with outer approval. People believe they are making ethical choices. In reality, they are following emotional cues, shaped by systems of control. They seek peace through silence, acceptance through self-erasure, belonging through conformity. The most dangerous aspect of this shift is its invisibility. Individuals do not feel forced. They feel responsible. They internalize the standards. They carry the shame without questioning its origin. Once morality is defined by those in power, it no longer serves justice. It serves structure, and shame becomes the wall that protects that structure. When shame becomes chronic, it does more than silence behavior. It begins to erode identity. This erosion is not sudden. It is gradual, unnoticed, and often misinterpreted as maturity, responsibility, or humility. In psychological terms, it is the internal collapse of selfhood in response to prolonged emotional suppression. Identity is formed through interaction, expression, and affirmation. When individuals speak, act, and explore freely, they discover who they are. This discovery requires freedom from constant evaluation. It requires space to fail without being branded as defective. When that space is denied, when every action is subject to judgment, shame enters as a silent editor. Internalized shame operates like an internal witness. It monitors thoughts before they form. It filters language before it is spoken. It evaluates feeling before it is fully felt. This constant interference disrupts the integration of self. The individual becomes fragmented. One part seeks truth, another part hides it. Over time, this split leads to identity distortion. The authentic self retreats. In its place, a socially acceptable version emerges. This version is cautious, agreeable, and vague. It avoids conflict, resists clarity, and adopts whatever traits reduce risk. It is not a person, it is a mask. Psychological models such as internal family systems describe this process as a division between exiled parts of the self and protective parts. Shame pushes certain memories, traits, or desires into exile. The protective self then appears, not to heal, but to prevent further pain. This strategy creates internal distance. The person can no longer access their full range of experience. Shame thrives in this distance. It labels the exiled parts as wrong. It repeats the narrative that those aspects are not welcome. It does not destroy the self. It hides it. And in that hiding, the person begins to forget what once felt natural. Individuals who carry deep shame often struggle to express preferences. They default to agreement. They defer decisions. They ask others what is right. This behavior is not politeness. It is the loss of a stable internal compass. The person fears that any expression might expose something shameful. The result is a life shaped by avoidance. Relationships are entered not for connection, but for protection. Careers are chosen not for purpose, but for predictability. Beliefs are adopted not from conviction, but from the desire to fit in. Every major choice bends towards safety. Clinical research supports these observations. Studies on shame and self-concept show a strong correlation between chronic shame and low self-coherence. Individuals with high shame proneness often describe themselves in inconsistent terms. They shift depending on context. They lack a clear narrative about who they are and what they value. This inconsistency creates further distress. Without a stable identity, anxiety increases. The person becomes preoccupied with perception. They scan for disapproval. They interpret neutrality as criticism. Their internal world is filled with false alarms. Emotional intimacy becomes difficult. Vulnerability requires clarity. It demands the ability to say, "This is me," but shame-trained individuals struggle to make that statement. They fear that exposure equals rejection, so they withhold, detach, or perform. Intimacy becomes performance, not presence. The voice of shame continues in the background. It asks whether others see the flaws. It reminds the person to be careful. It warns that honesty is dangerous. These thoughts become habitual. The person no longer notices them. They accept them as reality. In therapeutic settings, progress often begins when these thoughts are challenged. When the client is asked whether the judgment is accurate, whether the belief is theirs, whether the fear is still necessary. This process takes time. Shame resists interruption. Philosophers have long warned about this internal erosion. Jean-Paul Sartre described the gaze of the other as a force that turns the self into an object. Shame, in this framework, is the gaze internalized. It turns the subject into its own object, no longer living, but observing, no longer choosing, but performing. The molded person, shaped by shame, exists within this framework. Their body moves, their words flow, their life continues. But beneath the surface, the original self lies dormant, not because it failed, but because it was denied permission to exist. This denial is reinforced with each avoided truth, each faked response, each moment of silence. Over time, the molded version becomes the only one recognized. The individual forgets that anything was ever hidden. This process does not lead to healing, but to a gradual erasure of the self, where the individual is not safeguarded or restored, but slowly stripped of presence, voice, and identity until nothing original remains. Shame is no longer confined to private moments or confined social settings. In modern life, it has been amplified, digitized, and woven into the architecture of everyday experience. The same mechanisms that once existed in families, schools, and religious communities have been expanded into platforms, screens, and systems of mass behavior. Shame, once quiet and situational, now echoes across every device, every feed, every interaction. Social media has become the most powerful delivery system for shame. It combines surveillance with performance. Every post, photo, or comment becomes a potential source of validation or exposure. Algorithms promote content that triggers emotion, and shame is one of the most potent emotional triggers. Public shaming can go viral in minutes. A mistake, a misunderstood joke, or a single disagreement can lead to thousands of strangers casting judgment. The weight of collective disapproval creates a new kind of pressure, not only to behave, but to anticipate what others want and fear what they might reject. This environment trains individuals to self-censor constantly. Not only controversial views are suppressed, even subtle differences, minor deviations in tone, or honest confessions are evaluated for risk. Before speaking, there is hesitation. Before expressing, there is calculation. The audience is always present, even when unseen. The fear of digital exile operates like an internal law. The pressure extends into personal relationships. Text messages, voice notes, and virtual meetings become stages where tone and timing are endlessly analyzed. A delay in response can be interpreted as offense. A disagreement can lead to silent distance. The stakes of misinterpretation rise. Individuals adapt by limiting honesty. Authentic communication is replaced by curated approval. In professional environments, shame operates through metrics. Productivity, engagement, and reputation are measured, tracked, and compared. Performance reviews become moments of silent evaluation. Co-workers compete, not only in tasks, but in presentation. Any sign of emotional expression, fatigue, or divergence from the culture is viewed as weakness. Those who do not fit are isolated, not through punishment, but through withdrawal of recognition. Modern education contributes to this process. Standardized testing, competitive grading, and behavioral codes create a system where students learn to equate performance with value. A wrong answer is not just incorrect, it is embarrassing. A creative idea that does not match the rubric is discouraged. Students are taught to follow models, not to create their own. The lesson is clear: think safely, act predictably, do not invite attention unless it is guaranteed to be positive. This environment molds people long after formal education ends. The pattern continues in adult life. Choices in fashion, speech, lifestyle, and even thought are shaped by the desire to avoid exclusion. Individuals learn to anticipate what others find acceptable. They shape their identity around these assumptions. The result is a society where everyone performs, but no one feels seen. Marketing and consumer culture intensify the dynamic. Advertisements exploit shame to drive behavior. Products are offered not as tools for joy or improvement, but as solutions for inadequacy. Skin creams promise to erase visible flaws. Diet plans promise to remove unwanted weight. Courses and books promise to correct what is lacking. The message is repeated endlessly. Who you are is not enough. The fear of inadequacy becomes normalized. People learn to scan their lives for what is missing. They chase improvement without satisfaction. They compare their private lives to the public images of others. They feel behind, imperfect, and exposed. Shame becomes not an occasional feeling, but a continuous presence. In this state, individuals remain easy to mold. Their attention is fragmented. Their confidence is fragile. They seek guidance not from internal values, but from trending opinions. They align with causes they barely understand to avoid criticism. They accept information without examination to avoid looking uninformed. Their choices become responses, not decisions. This behavioral pattern is reinforced by the pace of modern life. Reflection is rare. Silence is avoided. Constant stimulation leaves little room for depth. In this condition, shame becomes background noise. Its presence is felt, but rarely identified. It shapes decisions, relationships, and self-perception without confrontation. The modern world rewards those who can adapt quickly, but punishes those who ask why. Questioning the standard, the system, or the direction often leads to subtle rejection. Those who remain compliant are praised for flexibility, but that flexibility often hides an internal fracture. They bend because they are afraid to break. In a culture saturated with comparison and curated identity, shame is no longer a reaction. It is a design, a system that maintains influence without force, a structure that replaces conscience with popularity, a pressure that shapes people from the outside inward. Shame molds the self by creating boundaries around thought, emotion, and action. These boundaries become habits. With repetition, they become personality. Over time, the molded self begins to feel natural. The restrictions feel personal. The caution feels like wisdom. The silence feels like maturity. But this state is not identity. It is compliance built on fear. Breaking this frame requires more than confidence. It requires awareness. Individuals who have been shaped by shame often struggle to see where the molding began. They believe their limitations are part of who they are. The fear of rejection feels like morality. The need for approval feels like principle. These beliefs must be interrupted before change becomes possible. The first point of interruption is recognition. Shame cannot be removed unless it is named. Psychological work begins by identifying the internal voice that criticizes without logic. This voice often mirrors past authority figures. It uses familiar phrases. It appears during decisions, conflict, and exposure. It is not reasoned. It is reflexive. In cognitive behavioral therapy, these patterns are known as cognitive distortions. They include personalization, black and white thinking, and catastrophizing. Shame strengthens these distortions by tying them to social survival. A small mistake feels like a complete failure. A disagreement feels like abandonment. A pause in conversation feels like rejection. To break this pattern, the internal framework must be challenged. Questions are used not for answers, but for clarity. Is this thought true? Is this judgment based on evidence? Whose voice does this sound like? What is the worst outcome, and is it survivable? These questions weaken the emotional grip of shame. Philosophical methods support this process. Socratic questioning, a form of disciplined dialogue, encourages critical thinking about assumptions. The goal is not to arrive at a conclusion, but to explore the source of belief. When applied to shame, it helps expose the artificial nature of its authority. The judgment does not come from truth. It comes from training. Another method involves shadow work, developed within the Jungian framework. Carl Gustav Jung identified the shadow as the rejected part of the self. These are traits, memories, and impulses that were deemed unacceptable. Shame pushes them into darkness. The process of reclaiming them involves reflection, expression, and often discomfort. But without this process, the self remains incomplete. Shadow work does not glorify all impulses. It does not deny the existence of moral limits. It recognizes that many disowned traits are neutral. Creativity, anger, sensuality, curiosity, and assertiveness are often rejected, not because they are wrong, but because they threaten the group's structure. Integrating them restores balance. The recovery of identity also involves deliberate risk. Individuals must practice expression before they feel safe. This might involve saying no without explanation, expressing a personal opinion, or setting a boundary. These actions activate fear. The fear signals the presence of shame. Moving through the fear, even in small ways, disrupts the mold. Support is critical during this stage. Shame thrives in isolation. Connection, when based on authenticity, provides a mirror that reflects truth instead of judgment. Relationships where honesty is welcome can undo years of suppression. This is not therapy, it is human contact without performance. Artistic expression can also be a tool. Writing, painting, movement, and voice allow parts of the self to emerge without censorship. The goal is not mastery, it is visibility. To put the unseen into form, to name the disowned, to breathe life into what was once hidden. This process is not linear. It includes resistance. Old habits return. The inner critic regains volume. There may be moments of relapse. These are not failures. They are evidence that the mold is cracking. The shame that once operated silently is now being confronted. Psychologically, progress is marked by increased self-consistency. Individuals begin to speak with fewer filters. They describe themselves with greater clarity. They make decisions aligned with personal values rather than social expectation. Their behavior becomes integrated. Their presence becomes steady. They are no longer easy to mold. This point is not the end. It is the beginning of self-authorship. The individual becomes capable of defining meaning, not in reaction to shame, but in pursuit of purpose. If you have recognized any part of yourself in this frame, write it down, not as confession, as identification. Describe one behavior, one belief, or one fear that shame has shaped. Let it be specific. Let it be real. This act alone disrupts the silence. The molded self is often praised. It is polite, agreeable, and manageable. It functions within systems without resistance. It avoids conflict. It seeks harmony. It obeys, but it is not whole. It is a sculpture, carefully carved by external hands, shaped not by intention, but by fear. And what is most disturbing is that this shaping occurred without consent. From early development, the human mind is vulnerable to influence. Identity formation is relational. Children absorb messages not only through language, but through tone, reaction, and presence. They watch the expressions of adults. They register disappointment before they understand it. They feel tension without explanation. And when these signals are consistent, the child learns to adapt. Adaptation in this context means survival. When expression leads to disapproval, the child removes it. When needs provoke irritation, the child suppresses them. When questions create discomfort, the child stops asking. The nervous system records these adjustments. The brain reshapes itself around what is safe. By the time this child reaches adulthood, the adaptations have become personality traits. They are described as easygoing, flexible, humble, or low maintenance. These labels are mistaken for virtue. In reality, they often describe a person who has been trained not to need, not to speak, not to exist fully. This training is not always violent. Often it is subtle. The absence of warmth, the silence after truth, the unspoken rule that certain topics cannot be discussed. The molded self emerges not through punishment, but through neglect and pressure. The individual is not sculpted through care, they are sculpted through erasure. This process is magnified by societal expectations. Culture assigns value to conformity. The individual who fits is rewarded. The one who resists is punished. Fashion, language, ambition, and even emotion are framed by what is acceptable. Deviations are labeled as abnormal. This labeling reinforces shame. The person who was once whole now divides into acceptable and unacceptable parts. Psychological research into identity fragmentation supports this process. Individuals who experience chronic invalidation often develop dissociative strategies. They separate from their emotions. They adopt different personas for different settings. They forget what they want, not because they are confused, but because they were never allowed to want. The tragedy of this molding is not just the loss of authenticity, it is the illusion of choice. People believe they have chosen their path. They speak of preference, lifestyle, and opinion, but beneath those words are scripts. Scripts learned from repetition, reinforced by shame, and executed without awareness. To be sculpted, without consent is to live according to someone else's design. It is to carry the values of others while believing they are your own. It is to fear judgment more than regret. It is to avoid pain at the cost of purpose. Breaking this illusion begins with disruption. When an individual encounters truth that contradicts the mold, discomfort arises. This discomfort is the first signal of recovery. It indicates that the internal structure is being challenged. The response is often defensive. Rationalization appears, doubt increases. The mold fights to remain intact. But disruption can lead to awakening. When a person recognizes the pattern, they begin to trace its origin. They ask who taught them to be quiet, who taught them to seek approval, who taught them to shrink. These questions are not accusations, they are excavation. They dig beneath the surface of personality and reach for the core. Therapeutic models support this excavation. Techniques such as narrative therapy, parts work, and trauma-informed exploration allow individuals to reconstruct identity, not by erasing the past, but by understanding it, by recognizing that much of what feels natural was installed. Once the false layers are seen, the person can begin to reclaim authorship. They no longer ask what others expect. They ask what is true. They no longer measure their words for safety. They speak from clarity. They no longer shape themselves to fit. They reshape their world to reflect who they are. This transformation does not occur quickly. It is not a moment, it is a process. Each step is met with resistance. The old mold offers comfort. It whispers of acceptance. It warns of loneliness, but it also restricts breath. It confines thought. It limits possibility. The person who breaks free does not become chaotic. They become real. They learn to live without shame as a compass. They move with purpose, not apology. They engage with others from truth, not performance. This person was always present, hidden, buried, and waiting. The molded self walks in step with the world. It receives praise for obedience. It avoids conflict. It adapts. It functions. From a distance, it appears successful. It does what it is told. It speaks without volume. It smiles when asked. It fits, but it is not free. To remain in that shape is to remain in someone else's narrative. The decisions feel personal, but they follow patterns carved by shame. The thoughts feel spontaneous, but they were rehearsed through years of conditioning. The actions feel chosen, but they are filtered through invisible permission. Freedom is not the absence of rules. It is the ability to see them. It is the capacity to choose, to act, and to speak without asking for approval. Shame interrupts that freedom. It replaces possibility with hesitation. It turns the unknown into danger. It punishes before risk begins. The most powerful systems never force submission. They invite it. They offer comfort for compliance. They offer belonging for silence. They offer safety for disappearance. And in time, the cost of resistance appears too high, but silence carries its own cost. A person who suppresses truth cannot live with clarity. A person who hides from rejection cannot connect with others. A person who fears their own voice will never speak with meaning. To escape this pattern, there is no need for rebellion. There is need for awareness. The power of shame fades in exposure. It relies on secrecy. It feeds on confusion. It survives through agreement. When that agreement ends, the spell breaks. You are not what they said you are. You are not the story they wrote. You are not the version that kept the peace. That version was constructed. It was designed to be easy to mold. You were not born to remain shaped by fear. There is nothing more threatening to systems of control than a person who has stopped apologizing for being whole. Not perfect, not safe, whole. The decision is quiet. It does not begin with a speech. It begins with refusal. A refusal to repeat the old words. A refusal to fit the shape. A refusal to carry what never belonged to you. The world may not reward that decision. It may respond with confusion, discomfort, or disapproval. But it is the only path toward a self that is not hollow. If this message stirred something in your thoughts, if it exposed a silence you have carried too long, then share this with someone who needs to remember who they were before shame took hold. Subscribe to this channel, not for content but for confrontation. Share it, not to inform, but to awaken. Let the next video carry you deeper into what most avoid, not because it is easy, because it is real. This journey is not about returning to who you were. It is about becoming who you were, never allowed to be. The version that was never shaped by fear. The version that no one dared to sculpt. They gave you a name, they gave you a mold, but the choice remains yours. You can keep the shape, or you can shatter it. Let the silence end where you stand.